So, given the state of the country, the state of the world, the personal shit, excuse me, that you have been through in the last couple of years, how in the world could you write a book called The Joy of Politics?
Good question. And it is not a sarcastic title, it is real. And for me, I first look at what America's been through. The pandemic, the isolation of all that. People have lost loved ones. They've lost their grandmas and grandpas. People have had to change their jobs or lose jobs. There is the political divides. There's the violence that we're seeing. And through all of it, yes, we can lament the setbacks. And I go through my own from, not winning the presidential campaign to losing my dad with late onset Alzheimer's and being diagnosed with breast cancer, something I know you can relate to, and all of this happening
Having
at once.
Your husband deal with a serious
COVID
case
himself.
of COVID.
So that's lamenting those setbacks, and it's important to do and realize what you've been through, but it is equally important to rejoice in the comebacks, to talk about how we get through things and how we get on the other side and the joy. And for me, it's joy in getting things done, joy in stepping back, as I'm sure you did when you got that breast cancer diagnosis, or when you lost your husband. You do step back and you have this gratefulness for things that happen to you every day, total strangers helping you out. So that's part of the joy as well.
Have you always been a glass half full person?
Yes, or I wouldn't have decided to run for president.
You're Minnesota nice too, right?
I have in there the story of going to talk to Barack Obama, and he looked super cool in his leather jacket. He was meeting with a number of the candidates. Didn't really endorse anyone, but it was one of the best meetings I had. I went over my chances, and then in that Barack Obama understated way, he goes, well, when I was running, most people put it less than 50% that I was going to win in the Democratic primary, and there were others that put it at even less. And then he went on to give me advice of just taking each day at a time, having a goal. If you don't have a North Star purpose, why do it? But then also being ready for all the things that go wrong every single day. And he listed a bunch of them that had happened to him, some public, some not public, and then how he got to where he was. So that conversation with him was really actually quite inspiring for me, because when you go into these things, your chances are not great. But then you remember, the winner of some of these last years, I think, Kentucky Derby was like 1 out of 80 odds. So you think it can happen.
You've also found a lot of inspiration, I know, Senator, from your fellow Senator, the late Paul Wellstone, who went to my high school in Arlington, Virginia.
Really? Oh, that's right.
Yeah, he is part of the Yorktown Wall of Fame, of which I am on as well. So we share this wall. He was an extraordinary man who died way too young in that plane crash. Yeah. Tell me about your relationship with him and how he has inspired your attitudes.
Sure. So no one ever thought he was going to win. He was a college professor. He went around in this green bus, kind of ahead of his time, I would say, in focusing on economic justice and
environmental issues.
Yes,
right?
And it's kind of like the little guy, and he would talk about how we don't need another Rockefeller. I'm for the little feller. And he had this buoyancy about him and joy. And he taught me so much when he then surprisingly comes from behind, wins a Senate race, is in the Senate. And I remember learning so much from him. For one thing, he taught me how to campaign on city buses. We would get on a bus and we would meet everyone on the bus. We'd go down what is called the Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis, and we would get to the end and we go, bye everyone. Then we get off the bus and we just get a ticket and go on the other way, back and forth, meeting people. And I remember when I was first running for the local office, county attorney, he goes, how's it going? And I showed him all my numbers about, how I could win this, and I was ahead of this other guy, and I was going to had all these support in the suburbs. And he goes, I don't care about the numbers. What are you going to say? How are you going to do things for people? I mean, that's what he was like. So the joy story about him I wasn't there, but his staff told me this. He had gone to the Senate floor and he had lost big time some amendment, and he'd made this passionate speech in his, 5'6" frame, and he'd and then he just lost. And he got back to the office, and everyone had their heads down. They'd been watching it on the Senate TV. They knew what happened. And he walked in, and he looks around at all of them, and it would some, I would say, self-recognition about the humor of this because he was so mad. And he goes, "What's going on in this room? Where is the joy? What happened to the joy?" And so I spend a lot of this book answering that question about what is the joy. There is joy in perseverance, whether it's through an illness or whether it's through trying to get a bill through Congress. And then there's that joy of getting things done and knowing, after working for years to pass a bill to bring down the cost of pharmaceuticals, that it finally happened. My bill finally got passed into law last summer. Or it's the joy of just being part of something bigger than yourself. That's what John McCain would always tell me. In fact, when I visited him when he was dying in Sedona, I tell the story in the book when my husband and I went to see him and Cindy. And at the end of the conversation, he was still irascible and hilarious and recalling our trip we had taken to Ukraine and wondering where the Ukrainian machine gun they'd give him as a gift was when it had been confiscated by the Navy. And at the very end of it, when he can't talk, he points to some words in his book. And the words were that he had written. And the words were, "There's nothing in life more liberating than fighting for a cause larger than yourself." And I think that's something we all have to remember right now. So as people gather again, it is exhilarating to go to events. I was at a Parkinson's walk last week where there were hundreds and hundreds of people just gathered, seeing each other again. Some were doing the quarter walk, some were doing a much longer walk. When people are showing up at political events again. We had 1,700 people at our annual Humphrey Mondale dinner that we have in Minnesota when Hakeem Jeffrey was our guest speaker just this last week. So there is just a lot of people seeing each other. And it's also important to see people you didn't always like from the company break room. People were all remote. They're on these Zoom screens. And now getting back together can be a scary thing, but it's also a good thing because the only way we're going to go back to having civic discussions of views and differing views is if we actually talk to each other again.
I know, that's so true. At the same time, I have to say I'm a pretty optimistic person. And I would like to see people talk who disagree on issues. But as you know, and as you write about, we have created our own ecosystems, our own friends group, our own kind of microcosms based on our political beliefs. They have become our identity. And I think bridging this divide and reducing polarization is the biggest existential threat our country faces. Mm-hmm. And I know the aforementioned President Obama has said that as well. Mm-hmm. Disinformation is the biggest threat to our democracy. So, it's great to be optimistic and think we can talk to one another, but it's not happening on Capitol Hill.
Well, so first of all, what you've said is just righteous. But to me, courage isn't just standing by yourself, giving some speech, yelling at everyone. Courage is whether or not you're willing to stand next to someone you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country. And in this book, I actually recount how things have happened. And it's not pretty. And I am never going to pretend that this book will stop all the anger in our politics. But when you look at what we've been through, the pandemic, the aftermath with the economy, through all of that, some incredible things happened last year, many of them bipartisan. So after years of working on infrastructure and why, they have high-speed broadband next to spewing volcanoes in Iceland and we don't have it in Lanesboro, Minnesota, you do start wondering maybe we can do better. And so this infrastructure bill that was a product of a number of senators actually working together, including Senator Portman and Senator Sinema and so many others, we got that passed. Then you fast forward, the gun safety bill, as we know from the events of this last months, from what we saw happen in Kentucky to Nashville to what just happened in Texas, that our work is so far not done. There is so much more has to be done. But finally, a group took on the NRA and did something about background checks and something about mental health funding. That was a big deal. Making semiconductors in America again. That was just dwindling. We were down to 12%. Bipartisan group again. Senator Schumer, Senator Todd Young of Indiana lead that effort. One of my more fun things that I recount in this book is Senator Cornyn and I, in the middle of the pandemic, joined forces to save our stages, the biggest investment in the arts in the history of America, because you can't stand in a mosh pit in the middle of a pandemic, much less an orchestra pit. And we had to keep those venues alive or the music was literally going to die. And we enlisted everyone from Pitbull to the Fargo Theater to help us get senators. And before you knew it, we had Mitch McConnell on the bill and Chuck Schumer on the bill, and we were able to move it. So those are legislative examples of that. But time and time again in the book, I recount how people, Roy Blunt and I, the insurrection, that was in our hands at the end of the day. We were the ones that had to make that walk with Vice President Pence over the broken glass, past the pillars filled with vulgarities to finish the job and make sure that democracy prevailed. We were the ones that had to do the investigation of the security failures at the Capitol, and then ultimately the ones who made sure when everyone wanted to put the inauguration in a bunker, and many did, that we stood up and said, no, we're going to take back that platform that those insurrectionists tried to strip down, and we're going to have people of both parties, everyone from George Bush and Dan Quayle to Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton on that platform to show that America peacefully passes on the torch of power. That was bipartisan. And so I don't think it's dead. And I certainly think the American people don't think democracy is withering on a vine when they turn out in record numbers to defeat election deniers, which was a real, I would say, shot in the arm for those that believe in democracy. And that just happened in the last election. So even though you see the horror of Paul Pelosi being bludgeoned with a hammer by a deranged man who's reading all this stuff on the internet, then a week or so later, you see Americans turning out in record numbers, including independents and moderate Republicans, to say, I'm going to vote for people that maybe I don't always agree with them, but I know they believe in our country. I know they believe in democracy and they'll salvage democracy, and I know they're patriots.
Isn't it shocking, though, when you hear that 60% of Republicans still believe the election was not fair? I mean, I hear you, and I think 87% of Americans consider themselves centrist or moderate, and you have these extreme factions on either side. But wow, that number is shocking to me. And yes, ultimately, the election deniers didn't win, but that view is still so prominent out in the United States of America, despite all evidence to the contrary.
Well, Donald Trump's shadow is still out there. He is still a force to be reckoned with within their party. But when you look again at the actual voting of Americans in this last midterm, people were horrified by that rhetoric. Independents turned out big time and actually voted Democratic. That's one of the reasons we kept the United States Senate against all odds and won with Reverend Warnock in the state of Georgia, a traditionally red state, or that Mark Kelly was able to win his race in Arizona. These are sensible people, actually. I think Hakeem Jeffries calls them Team Normal, Team America. And
I want to get that T-shirt, Team Normal.
There you go. And they were making a sensible case about our democracy. So that's, I know there's polls all over the place, and including the one you just cited, but I just can't help but looking at the actual elections.
Yeah.
What happens in the end when America, they may be understandably grumbling about a politician or not like a certain position or what's been happening. But in the end, when faced with, do I want to have someone that actually is out there fomenting an insurrection or fomenting divides? Or do I want someone that sees the hope, that wants to get things done, that wants to work across the aisle? Many of them tend to go to that second candidate.
I can't help but ask you about gun violence, something that I care deeply about. And I've been pretty outspoken for years now, just because I couldn't understand after all those first graders were mowed down in Sandy Hook, and the fact that I think at the time the vast majority of Americans favored sensible gun laws. And 74% of the NRA actually favors sensible gun laws. Why more could not have gotten done? It was so frustrating to me. And I'm just curious. I mean, this year is setting a record for mass shootings. This shopping mall in Texas, this guy gets out, just mows people down with an AR-15, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about the assault weapons ban, because I know that Congress, I know that Congress, as it stands today, with the Republican majority in the House, could never pass another assault weapons ban. But for crying out loud, what is the argument against it? Is it because there's so many already out there? You know, there are more guns than people in this country, more gun stores than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. And so, you know, when you see the carnage caused by these weapons of war, you wonder what the hell is going on in this country.
Well, I am from a strong hunting state. It's the way the quality of life in Minnesota. And I always look at these proposals and say, would this hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? My Uncle Dick loved hunting. And the answer is no. They don't need AR-15s. They don't need assault weapons. So then you go to your next question. Could it practically do anything if we banned the purchase of these assault weapons? And my answer is yes. And let me give you some examples of this. When you look at the two shootings in Uvalde, Texas, those little fourth graders in their classrooms, I met one of the classmates who has pictures of her best friend who she lost as she, in the classroom across the way, was able to crawl out the window and never see her best friend again. Or in Buffalo, where a dad goes to get a birthday cake for his little kid and never comes back. When you look at those were both 18-year-olds who were waiting to turn 18 and then bought an assault weapon on the internet. 25 years ago, or how many years ago, we had that assault weapon ban in place. People weren't doing things like that. So even Senator Manchin has favored banning for future purchase of assault weapon bans for 18 to 21-year-olds. You know, so you look at that. So that's one thing you can do. And then after you ban them, you could do all kinds of things with gun buybacks
and the like.
And it has worked in other places. There's just no reason we have to accept this as it is. Or the perpetrator down in Nashville putting an assault weapon in a backpack and walking in. And by the way, I happened to be there a week after that shooting. I visited that school, and then I was in Ann Patchett's bookstore only because I wanted to meet her.
Yeah.
I like her stuff. And by a chance meeting, one of these moms whose kid survived, a third grader, ran into us and just started sobbing. And she took out her phone and she told the story as she's buying children's books, and Ann Patchett is getting books for her to read that'll help her child because her child can't sleep. And she shows us the text that started that morning of a group of moms planning a jazz festival at their school. And the first ones are, who should we have? What musician should we have? And then all of a sudden one of the moms says, oh no, it says there's a live shooting. It must be wrong. At our school, it must be wrong. Someone writes back, yeah, it's probably the internet. Someone writes back, no, I can hear the sirens. You go through this entire morning where they're then at the fire station or wherever they gathered, and you have one of the texts says, they found Haley, hallelujah. They found this, the kids. Where's Evie? The last text is, we lost Evie. And the mom shows me the picture of her own daughter with these 3 children in a little photo of only 6 kids from the week before. 3 of the kids are now lost. And when you saw the text going from normal to horror, it just made me think, how can we allow this to continue to happen? So I go back to the fact that political movements start with individuals. And what you've seen in Nashville with people pushing back when those legislators were basically pushed out and expelled from the legislature, and then their constituents said no way, and it became a national issue, and they came back. Tennessee has one of the lowest voter registration rates in the country, which shocked me. You think it's not going to be motivating for people to register? So I just think these movements start. No one thought that in the state of Kansas, after the Dobbs decision came out and Roe v. Wade was pushed out, that in this middle of the prairie that all these people would turn out and say, no, we want our reproductive rights, in more numbers than even had voted in the midterm before. That's what happened in Kansas. So people turn out to vote, and that's what we are banking on for 2024 as it comes up, because I can't promise you the House is going to do anything. What I do know just happened, as in last year, when the House was Democratic. But what happened last year is Republicans and Democrats joined together and took on the NRA for the first time. They closed the boyfriend loophole. That was my bill forever. Started out with one other author. Did something about mental health funding. Got a start on incentives for background checks. But of course it's not enough. But it shows that there was a will to take it on, and a much better will than we had back when Donald Trump was president. Parkland happened, and I went and was invited to the White House, sat directly across from him, back next to Mike Pence, had a piece of paper, and every time he said he'd want background checks, I had a hashtags, and I'd mark it down. And it was something like 9-10 times where he said, oh yeah, we should do background checks. We should do background checks. We should do background checks. And then literally the next day, he goes in and meets with the NRA and folds. So we just can't have any more folding when you think of these little babies getting slaughtered in parking lots just going to the mall in Texas.
Let me talk about another issue that I care deeply about. I wonder if you had this same experience. You and I were both diagnosed with breast cancer. We were very lucky because you were stage 1A and I was,
which I thought was an apartment unit when I first heard it.
And we both had lumpectomies and radiation. And I just want to ask you about our healthcare system, Senator, because I couldn't help but think I am so lucky. I have the best health care. I live in New York City. I have the best doctors. I have good health insurance. And, you know, when you think that Black women have a 40% higher mortality rate than white women from breast cancer, that so many women can't afford or don't have access to preventative screening for all kinds of cancer, you know, is our health system, our healthcare system, as screwed up as I think it is?
I think it has a lot of problems that need to be fixed. And some of this is pharmaceutical prices, which does affect everyone. So if you have less money and not as good a plan, it affects you even more. If you, like someone in Minnesota, the kid was on her health care because the Affordable Care Act guaranteed that till 26. He turns 26. He's diabetic, starts rationing his insulin, which should have never been that expensive, and gets the numbers wrong and died. That mom came out to Washington as my guest to the State of the Union to make that point. So that's part of
horrific.
it. And you have seen major advancements on this in terms of finally pushing Medicare negotiation because the prices were locked in double what they are in so many countries. We have the most expensive drugs of any industrialized nation, yet our taxpayers are the ones that funded so much of the research. So I would start with that. It's a total outrage. We put limits on insulin prices, and you're starting to see some of that either voluntarily or happen. We're going to put a limit on out-of-pocket costs. So there's been changes afoot right now for the consumer when it comes to health care. The other piece of healthcare, which is troubling to me that we're not talking about enough, is the workforce shortage. One of the outcomes, it was already going on before the pandemic, but one of the outcomes of the pandemic is if you can get a job on a Zoom screen, that might be a lot easier than working in an assisted living, which is related, of course, to healthcare, or working at a hospital ER room.
I think a third of nurses have left the industry.
Right. And so, of course, that's about pay. It is also about immigration reform. It's also about creating incentives to bring more people back. I have a bill that called the Conrad 30 bill for when people come from other countries and study at our medical schools. We allow a certain number of them, but only a certain number, to stay after they've been trained in American medical school. When we don't have enough doctors in rural parts of our country or in certain urban areas of our country, we should be making it easier for people to stay. We should be recruiting people like they are in Canada. And so I think that is another piece of this, is improving our workforce, our healthcare workforce.
What about insurance companies?
Right, that's what I was going to get to next. So we've finally done something on emergency medical bills so they can't just shock you in their amounts, that there's limits on it. But there is more we should be doing in terms of transparency about how much things really cost, and looking at expanding Medicare to go down to possibly 55. Those kinds of things would be a good step, and that's one of the bills that I favor.
Did the Affordable Care Act help?
Yes.
And I don't know, it just doesn't feel, it feels like we've gone backwards.
Well, the Affordable Care Act has made a major difference for people. Millions and millions and millions of more people got health care. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And if we're talking about breast cancer, millions of women now had access to that kind of screening that wasn't available to them before. That's a big, big deal. And, we continue to debate. I had a bill with Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the Early Act that passed, about making sure, especially when younger women are diagnosed,
right,
we
which
know
is
that
happening
certain
more and more.
genes and certain groups are in this high-risk group to get it early. And that is, of course, the most devastating thing, to get that diagnosis when you're still a young mom or you're starting your life out. So the prevalence is less, trying to focus and use our knowledge of medicine to get those people tested more so that they have a chance to catch it early, which we all know catching it early is a key part of this. And yes, in my case, like yours, during the pandemic, I maybe wasn't quite as up to date on everything I was supposed to do, and I had waited too long. And when they first told me, we just did this mammogram and it looks like there's some problems here, I said, I'm sure it's fine. I promise. Well, you need to get this checked again right away. And I'm like, yeah, and I still remember the feeling as I took off that hospital gown, put on my suit, put my lipstick on, and said, I am ready to go out and do my press conference on vaccines. That's what I did. I just go, I promise. Well, luckily a week later, I did go back. And that was when I found out that I had this stage 1A cancer, and I got the call in Washington and had to go into the Senate chamber and vote. And I think then the experience and your experience gets to be like a lot of people's experiences, because for the most part, if we can get the detection, and now we know so much more that not everyone is a mastectomy, that some are a lumpectomy, which is what I had, especially if you catch it early. That radiation may not have to be forever. Not everyone is chemotherapy. Of course, the most serious cases. And I feel really lucky that that's where I landed with the radiation and with the lumpectomy. But putting that story out there, as I did, in finding out, as I discuss in the book, that other people then go in and get their own exams, which they're guaranteed with the Affordable Care Act, by the way, that they go out and get their own exams. And then they found out they had it. This woman named Melissa from Maple Grove, she wrote a letter to our office. I wanted the senator to know that I went out there. I heard about her story, went out, and I found out I had stage 2 cancer. I'm now getting treatment. So when I wrote the book, and I know you've written books before, I thought, well, I better check this out. I got to get, 1, make sure it's true. 2, make sure she's okay even by identifying her by her first name. So I got her number from the letter, and I called her up, and she said, you will not believe it. I am right now in the clinic getting my checkup, and to find out if I'm cancer-free a year later. And a year later, she find out. I go, okay, well, call me. Here's my number. And like 3 days later, she calls and says I'm cancer free. So I've never met her, but I now picture her with that that gown, holding a little cup of coffee, waiting to go in and get her exam. But that's the joy of actually getting a story out that's hard and not easy, and then other people listen, it resonates, and they take care of themselves. That's a pretty good thing about using what is a really bad experience for good.
Yeah.
And no one knows that better than you, Katie Couric.
Well, it's been one of the most important parts of my life to talk about colon cancer after losing my husband, and now breast cancer after my own experience. So I think, everyone has to shout it from the mountaintops because too few people are still getting screened for so many diseases that it really is the difference between life and death if these cancers are detected early. And so thank you for being so public about your situation. It makes a huge difference.
Yes. And I tried to do it, as horrible as the whole thing is, with some humor of the situation as well, that you can get through it, including one of my best stories was I'm waiting to get what I thought was a lumpectomy, and I'm laying there. I've got this target literally drawn on my breast. I'm wearing those, hospital thing over me. And this woman comes over and says, "Hey, Senator," and you don't have your phone, right? They've taken away. I go, yeah. And this wouldn't happen to everyone. She goes, "Could I talk to you about Burma? There's some really bad things happening, and I happen to know a lot about it." And I go, "Yes, I know." She goes, "Yeah, but it's getting worse here, and there's a lot of refugees." 10 whole minutes, okay, on and on. But I go, "Look, I want to help you, but I don't have my phone because I'm going into the surgery, and they've taken away, but I do want to help you." And so now they're wheeling me away, and they put the anesthesia in. And
she's still talking about Burma?
No, she's now left. But most people count sleep. They say, think of peaceful things. All I'm saying over and over in my head so I won't forget is, don't forget Burma. Don't forget Burma. Don't forget Burma. Then I wake up hours later and my husband's there. And I look at him and he goes, first thing I do say, was it a lumpectomy or mastectomy? Because I'd given them permission to do that, and you don't know what's going to happen. He goes, it was a lumpectomy. And I'm feeling kind of sick from the anesthesia. I go, okay, good. Then could you give me my phone? I got to write the staff about Burma. And then he said, well, I guess you're okay then. So there were some things that I uniquely experienced that other people did. But I'm trying to make that point that so many other people have, especially when you get the call and then you got to walk into the Senate to all those people in that room. And they're just telling you, wait, why aren't you on this bill? Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. And I remember 15 minutes after I found out, Dick Durbin, who's a great, nice guy, the senator from Illinois, but he tells me I can't be the lead on the Violence Against Women Act, which I've been asking forever because 2 other senators were more senior and they want to do it. And I just go, and he looks at me so nice, and I go, whatever. And he goes, whatever? Because he thought I was going to fight and it wouldn't have mattered anyway. And I go, yeah, whatever. I got a lot going on today, so whatever. It's like that. And so there was a bit of freedom in the whole thing. But
it does kind of give you a new perspective on the things that matter.
Realize you probably couldn't have gotten that done anyway, that you were going to be the lead on the bill, so you just kind of let it go. And then they kept calling the names in that monotone voice. They go, Senator Duckworth, Senator this, Senator Hess, and I'm standing there going, life is just going on, man. And I can't tell any of these people about this because one of them will tell the press and I'll have no privacy. I've got to wait till the story is mine.
Right.
And I can tell it myself, which I did. And so that's another weird thing, to be in the public light as you are, and then trying to figure out how you're going to be able to have your own private thing with your family to figure out how to get something, which I felt like we handled pretty well.
And I know I interviewed you about it when you talked about it. God, I'm so interested in policy. I could talk to you about policy all day long, Senator. I'm worried about what's going to happen with immigration because of this. But I also want to talk about your presidential run. So can we just touch on what's going on with immigration
Sure.
real quickly, only because it's so timely
right now.
Tell us.
With this change in policy that had been put in place because of the pandemic,
which is Title 42.
Title 42. We're now through the pandemic, so that changes.
Well, can you
what
explain
happens
to
at the
people who
border.
may not be policy wonks?
Right. So the Title 42 emergency, which was started during the Trump administration, continued through the Biden administration till now, was put in place as an emergency measure for public health reasons.
Because
that
of
people
COVID.
who are seeking asylum, this isn't just people randomly crossing, right?
Right.
They just can't walk in. Seeking asylum because of it's defined by law as something that's dangerous to them, that they could no longer, they couldn't just come through the border and ask for asylum. So that emergency order had to be lifted to go back to how we've been through many administrations before. That was what happened. So now there's concern and about will there be a flood of people coming through. That's
and they're
why
predicting 10,000
right,
people
and that
a
is
day.
why the administration has sent additional troops down there, not to actually, from what I understand, be at the border immediately, but be nearby to help with the people, the customs officers, and the people who are officers, but they are the ones that are designated to be on the border. One of the things, two solutions here. One of them is to process people not on the border, but back in places like Guatemala and Honduras, where so many of these
In El Salvador.
asylum seekers in El Salvador and other places are coming from, to do that. The other one is to have immigration reform. And I cannot tell you how much we need this, because in the northern states, we actually are down to, in some cases, 2-3% unemployment. We don't have enough ag workers. We don't have enough tourism people. We don't have enough people in healthcare. Especially in some of these rural states,
Right.
Nursing homes are closing down. So we're in a crisis, and no great nation, to explain, has ever expanded that I know of into even greater nation with a shrinking workforce. We can try to be the first experiment, but I'd rather not do that. So how do you do that legally to make this work and be able to vet people? You do that with a more robust legal immigration system. So you're letting people in with vetting more straightforwardly, so you don't have situations like we have where we bring people in and it works to work with our corn growers or planting or do pork producers. We have a ton of people come in America, including my state, like that. Well, right now, a number of them are just deciding to go work in Canada. Why? We have a rule in place that their spouse can't also work for 5 years. When they are here on work permits, they have been vetted, but we make it so hard and so difficult that it's easier to go work in other countries. And so we're really having a problem right now, and we need to update our rules, both for, of course, dreamers who've been living in this country through no fault of their own. And we know that the ones that have been all following the rules and should be able to be on a path to citizenship. For Afghan refugees, a bill that I lead, people that helped our military, Lindsey Graham and I lead that bill to get them out of the limbo that they're in. There's 80,000 of them in our country right now. For people who want to come here maybe on work permits, visas, and the like, we need to make the legal part of this work better. And then we can put more, as we've always had as part of this deal, resources at the border. But to think we're just going to close off our country and not bring in immigrants legally. Our country was built on immigrants. Immigrants don't diminish America. They are America.
And yet, immigration is so weaponized, particularly by the far right in this country, that it seems unlikely that there will be immigration reform. I mean, it wasn't the last time they tried to do it with McCain and Kennedy?
I was in that group. So I first came to the Senate.
And how long ago was that?
They invited me into that group. George Bush was president, and he really wanted to get it done, still does. He put a lot into that, but it was right near the end of his presidency. And just for people who have understandable border concerns, part of this was more order at the border. Part of this was putting in the necessary, not just officers, but also judges and others that we would need to process these things in a smart way. So that failed because that effort failed on the immigration because of sort of right-wing talk radio and the like. Then it was tried again and passed through the Senate. Senator Grassley was the chair of the Judiciary Committee at the time. Passed through the Senate. Obama was president. And that got done, but then it failed in the House. Then the next time Trump is president, a more scaled-down version led by Senator Mike Rounds, not exactly a liberal, a conservative Republican from South Dakota, kind of takes the dreamers, puts them on a path, the temporary status people, and then finally a number of these visa work permits raises the cap. And again, more money at the border, order at the border, more rules at the border. And puts it into a package. We had 15 Republicans on that. Tim Kaine and I were involved in that negotiation. Heidi Heitkamp, there were about 15 of us. Susan Collins. That thing, Trump gut punches it. It fails because he doesn't support his own party. So that's 3 times. So this is our 4th moment.
And do you think it's going to happen?
I think something is going to have to happen because of this weird dual problem. You've got problems at the border, but you also have problems of not having enough legal immigration.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that real quickly, and maybe I'll come to your office and I'll take you to lunch and you can explain this to me even more. But how difficult is it to determine people who are truly seeking asylum, who have legitimate concerns about their safety, and those who may be just looking for financial opportunities, which I think they're needed too.
But you do have to determine it under the law.
How do you do that?
Well, I think the best way you do it is by having them seek this asylum in their own country, because all of this people coming up is very dangerous for them. Traffickers get involved. Kids get trafficked. So the best is to process these cases in a legal immigration system where they are. So that would be the first thing. And then you look at whether the standards are met, and it actually gives you better ability. That's why I keep talking about this combo of the legal immigration and then pushing back on what's not legal immigration, is you would then have the resources. Because Grover Norquist favored immigration reform because it brought the debt down in 10 years by over $150 billion, because people are finally paying into taxes and things instead of working in the shadows. So some of this money can be used to figure out what is real and what's not when processing these cases. And one of the things that I note in the book, not to try to bring it back to the book, but I want to, is just that some of these long-term issues have just festered. Some of it's because of this filibuster in the Senate, because we were going to try to do some immigration reform in this Inflation Reduction Act, and it just couldn't fit into the little exception to the filibuster. It is everything from making it harder to work on climate to voting rights. A bunch of these things are just stymied because of these archaic Senate rules. And I make the case in here that we need to make changes to that.
Do you think that is ever going to happen, though?
It was going to happen with voting, and it was just 2 votes short of doing that. And now Senator Fetterman has come in, and he favors doing something on the filibuster. And again, maybe people wouldn't just get rid of it. They would just make exceptions. There's 160 exceptions to the filibuster. That 160 for things like space accidents, but not voting, that would allow us to do that. Presidents, no matter if they're a Democrat or Republican, they don't get their whole teams in because it's just such gridlock in terms of the voting. I think you should take some of those people, some of those nominees out of the process, lower level ones, so that we don't have all this gridlock and a president can get in their team. It is really hard to compete internationally if we make it so hard to hire people for very important jobs. And of course, cabinet members, we should be able to debate those and some of the top people with top agencies, but it's just gotten out of control. So I'm not going to go on, but in this book, I actually have solutions to some of this, in addition to some very fun stories about the presidential debates, just as we enter a presidential debate
good.
time.
Actually, that's great segue, because you talk a lot about your 2020 presidential bid, which fittingly, as the senior senator of Minnesota, was launched in the middle of a blizzard.
Now, we don't let a little snow stop us. We don't let a little cold stop us. Like, are you guys even cold? Tell the truth. Okay. Now, when I said that elected leaders should go not just where it's comfortable, but also where it's uncomfortable. This is what I meant. As the first woman elected to the United States Senate from the state of Minnesota, to announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
Memories.
Memories of hoping that no one would freeze. Memories of we had to start bonfires so that there would be like literally no one freezing. It was supposed to be cold, but it wasn't supposed to snow. And while it was this beautiful backdrop, there were people that were literally encrusted in snow. Then out in the crowd was which I recount in the book, the woman who has cut and colored my hair for decades, named B. And she'd come out early, and she was like, she'd done my hair right before I went out there. And she was later told me she was out there praying. And I said, "Oh, B, you didn't have to go out there. It was so nice of you. And I'm going to be fine. We've got this great team." She goes, No. It was the bad intersection of a blizzard and a haircut. And she goes, "You didn't notice, but I saw some gray coming in on your part. And I took a bunch of brown stuff and I sprayed it on there. And I was sitting out in the crowd thinking, oh my God, it's going to start dribbling down her face on
kind of like Rudy
national
Giuliani."
TV, which, yes, I note him in a footnote. Yeah. I note that he needed a B, but he needed a lot more than that because he wasn't even in a blizzard like I was.
Exactly.
So, that never happened, but it was truly a joyous thing. And our odds were slim, but it was important for me to make the case. I think pragmatic. When I look back at that speech, it meets the test of time. I was talking about workforce and how important was. I was talking about immigration reform. I was focused on technology, which many of my opponents were not talking about the need to put rules of the road in place when it comes to tech companies. And it was about bringing our country together, crossing the river of our divides. I was on the Mississippi River, just blocks from where that 35W bridge had collapsed years before.
I covered that.
Talking about bridging those rivers and the metaphor of the Mississippi River running through our country all the way from Minnesota to Louisiana to New Orleans, the place of our resilience, and that our country was resilient. So that was the theme of it, and we went from there to town halls in Iowa and casino basements in Nevada and debates and unbelievable events all over the country. And one of the things that can happen when you're running for president, especially in a crowded primary, you can start to hate the people you're running against or like them. And I actually grew to like them more. I love the fact that in one night in Miami, we doubled the number of women ever in either party's presidential debate stage in one night. And we showed the world that women who are running, from Elizabeth to Kamala to me, Kirsten, that the women look different, they wore different clothes, they came from different parts of the country, and here's what's most important. They had different views and they could debate each other. So that was a cool thing on its own. And then there were clear policy differences. I was more of a moderate in the race, and I stuck to that. When it comes to things like, I remember saying in New Hampshire at a town hall, I wish I could staple a free college diploma under your chair, kid, but I can't. And I explained what I thought was a better way to go at helping people in need and the importance of 1- and 2-year degrees and the like. But my fondest memories were of those debate stages where just the craziest things happened. Couric and I, at one debate, no one was calling on us, and we just started writing hilarious notes back and forth on the debate stage to each other. And at one debate,
like, what am I, a potted plant?
Yeah, and Andrew Yang had offered some kind of raffle that people could get $1,000 to illustrate his basic universal income proposal if they just entered. And I wrote a note to Couric and it said, "Booker, do not do that. Maybe against campaign finance laws. You cannot give money away for votes." I tossed that over to Booker. Or Elizabeth and Kamala and I, of course, we never talked about the male candidates in the bathroom breaks. Okay, well, maybe we did. Or when Kamala and I got freezing cold on the debate stage in Atlanta, and they had put it down way too cold. It was freezing. And we, in our 4-minute break, were huddled together explaining to the stage manager that women do worse performing when it's too cold compared to men, and that it wasn't fair. And I took out a math study to show him the numbers. And then the best of all was in L.A. when I had Bernie was to my right, which alone was funny, and Steyer was on the other side, Tom Steyer. We have those 5 minutes, you've done debates, where people are scribbling down their notes. And I'm all like, you're writing what you're going to say, statistics you want to use, lines you want to use. My pen just explodes. And it's the one they've given us. I turn to Bernie, elbow him. I'm like, I need a pen. Now he's using his, and he takes his pen out. We were never supposed to bring in pens. But this is the day I realized all the men could just hide these pens in their pockets. So he takes out one for himself, gives me his debate pen. I start using the same one, and it breaks down too. Then I turn to Steyer on my left. He luckily has one, his own pen, gives
Good
me,
Lord.
and I'm finally able to write the notes. And I just want to thank those guys because that debate was one of my best ones.
I can't let you go without turning to 2024 briefly.
Sure.
There has been, and this is not a surprise question, Senator, a lot of concern about Joe Biden's age. And do you think that's a legitimate concern?
I think what the legitimate issue is, who is going to continue moving this country forward? And Joe Biden has shown that his experience has been a good thing, that the people he's put in have been fantastic in these cabinet positions, and that he's moved us out of this pandemic. He has brought dignity back into the White House. And I just think in the end, when independents and moderate Republicans look at this, and as you look at Donald Trump's support that's growing with the MAGA base of their party, they're going to look at this and say, no, we don't want to go back to that chaos and hate and divisiveness. And that's why I'm supporting Joe. And that's why I think he will win this race.
Can the country survive another Biden-Trump election? Honestly,
the country survived a lot, and we still don't know who the candidate is going to be on the other side.
But you believe, don't you, that it's probably going to be Donald Trump?
Right now, if you looked at the pure numbers, you'd believe that. But there are going to be a lot of things, as I learned in my primary campaign. There's a lot of twists and turns that the road takes on the way there. There really are. And so many of our candidates who people thought were the front runner in other elections on both sides of the aisle ended up not being the front runner in the end. So I don't think that's a given at all.
Do you foresee the Senate ever going back to moderate leaders, or will extremes on the spectrum continue? You're a moderate.
Yes, exactly. I'm in leadership. I'm in number 4 in leadership.
You're kind of an endangered species.
Yeah. Well, I think what really the measure here is right now is, do you have a party that you can bring in different views? And believe me, our party made all kinds of compromises in order to get these bills done. Remember, we had a smashing 50-50 majority. That's it. We didn't even have a majority. And we were able to work with Republicans on the bipartisan infrastructure bill and on so many other things to get this done. So I think the answer is, are you getting things done for people? And is your party willing to take in and have as standard bearers people of slightly different political views? There's no way everyone should be in lockstep. And what concerns me about the Republicans right now is that with Donald Trump's sway over that party is going way the other way.
And what concerns you about Democrats?
Well, what concerns me about Democrats is that sometimes we don't exactly explain our message. Al Franken used to joke that we had a bumper sticker and with our point, and then there'd be another bumper sticker that would say, to be continued, and they would go all the way around a car. And I will say we did do one really well in the last year, and that was the abortion issue, where we clearly said very succinctly it should be a woman's decision to make her own health care choices, not a politician's. And then if I had to add one more bumper sticker, it would be, and we don't need Ted Cruz in the waiting room.
Would you ever run for president again?
I am focused on supporting this president and my work in the Senate. And as you have pointed out by many of your questions in the past hour, we have a lot on our plate and a lot to do.
Amy Klobuchar, it's so great to talk to you. Your book is called The Joy of Politics.
And it's fun.
It's fun and joyful. Surviving Cancer, a Campaign, a Pandemic, an Insurrection, and Life's Other Unexpected Curveballs. And boy, there have been plenty of them for you and for the country. So I think this would be a great anecdote for the state we're finding ourselves in.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks, Amy.
It's been great to be on.
Can I call you Amy?
Yes, that's what most of my constituents call me. Yes.